Right, goeienaand, good evening. I'm Johann Rossouw, professor here at the UFS Department of Philosophy and Classics. Next to me is my good friend and colleague from English, Dr. Rick de Villiers. So we welcome you on behalf of our two departments. And before we turn to our friend Ivan here, also just a word of thank you to Alma from Exclusive Books, always so reliable to come and help us.
Speak up a little bit.
Help us with the book exhibition. And then to our caterers, also thank you very much. And of course our host here, the Planetarium, with whom I myself and some colleagues in the audience have worked very well over the years. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be here. So yeah, without further ado, Ivan, thank you very much for making the trek out to Bloemfontein from Johannesburg today. Ivan is a distinguished professor of creative writing at Wits University, and for my personal preference, maybe South Africa's foremost living English writer. I'm sure Ivan is so humble he would immediately disagree with me, but that's my opinion. And yeah, Ivan, I see some audience members does have of his previous books here. I think, Ivan, you debuted in the late 80s.
Yep. Yep.
First, Ivan made a mark as a short story writer. And then from there on, he gradually moved, of course, into novels. And also, I'm not exactly sure how we'll describe what we're discussing tonight, which is, I'd say, maybe the second book in your oeuvre that goes along this path, sort of autofiction, personal observations, philosophical observations, the kind of meditative, reflective writing about themes that mean a lot to anybody in South Africa today. And so we've asked Ivan just to give you an idea, to set the tone, to begin with reading 2 pages from the Near North before Rick and I will go into the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Johan, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be in Bloemfontein talking to you once again. So this is a section from the Near North, which is made up of fragments and short essays and short passages. If you live in a place long enough, it becomes peopled with ghosts. Pass down a street or turn a corner, and you see people you used to know, sometimes as they were many years ago, stepping out of a car, going through a door, walking along the pavement, smoking a cigarette. Some of these ghosts are impostors, mere emanations of the living to whom they are still attached. Others are true spirits. They represent the dead. Ghosts and memories are easily mistaken for one another. In familiar places, you might see yourself too, as you once were, standing at a window or waiting on a corner for a light to change, doing one of the many forgettable things you used to do. Occasionally, you might even see yourself as you will be years from now, let's say bending to pick up a dropped key or looking over your shoulder to make sure you aren't being followed. Returning to familiar places after an absence can bring the ghosts from the shadows. In the old ways, Robert Macfarlane tells a moving story about his friend Roger Deacon, with whom he once walked the hollow ways, the sunken paths of Dorset. After Roger died suddenly, Macfarlane returned to walk the same route and was not surprised as a seasoned wayfarer to find his friend still there, to catch startlingly clear memory glimpses of Roger himself seen at the turn of a corner or ahead of me on the path. There was memory glimpses. Much of our experience is made up of fleeting, irretrievable moments. While revisiting places might sustain those rare associations that survive in memory, Long absence can sever them completely. My friend Janice lived in Johannesburg as a young woman before immigrating to America, and when she returned from time to time, seldom saw much more than the homes of her hosts. Once I offered to drive her around to some of her old haunts. The geography of the city had faded from her memory, and with it many of the things we had done together. But don't you remember when we used to visit Deborah here? We were living in Tudhope Avenue, you must remember. Certain places and events came back to her, but in isolation, like photographs in an album from which most of the images had been pilfered. Losing territory in the sense of access rather than ownership undoes memory. As the doors to parts of the city have closed, the memories associated with them have faded. I'm cut off from this past as surely as if I had immigrated. Like other exiles, I write against the fear of oblivion, tending and replenishing my file in the archive of collective memory. Recreating a place in words gives it some kind of continuance, even if the exhibit has the artificiality of a museum and cannot provide a home. In the end, as Theodore Adorno understood, the writer is not even allowed to live in his writing.
Thank you, Ivan. So I think there, for the audience members, you have a very good example of the tone, the atmosphere of this very melancholic book. And there's this key sentence which has to do with a lot of what this book is about. Losing territory in the sense of access rather than ownership undoes memory. So this link between territory, place, memory is maybe the key motif of the whole book. So Ivan, I just want to ask for a start. I guess so many of these discussions start there. It sounds like this tells you a bit of why you chose to write this book. And could you just elaborate a little on what moved you to write this book?
I think the sort of central dynamo of it was a move that I made from one part of the city to another. So I've lived in Johannesburg for going on 50 years now, 45 years. I've nearly always lived in the eastern suburbs. So I've lived in Yeovil and Malvern and Berea and those parts of the city. And I spent many years in Troyville and Kensington, and that was the territory of my book Portrait with Keys. And that part of the city is very dear to me. Some years ago, about 10 years ago, I was compelled to move, I should say, by circumstances, and I moved to the northern suburbs. And I'd always had a bit of a block about the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. Used to go there for entertainment and so on, but never wanted to live there. Always liked the slightly edgier sides of Johannesburg. And so moving to the north, it turned out to be a very disorienting experience. Yeah. And that's really, that's the mainspring of the book, is finding yourself after a long period of comfort and familiarity in the same city, but feeling somewhat like a stranger.
Yeah, I must say it often reminded me of a quote a neighbor of mine made when I had moved back to Pretoria in 2007 after about a decade of absence, and she said to me, even if you live in Pretoria, you would still be missing Pretoria. So that often one gets that sense in your book, that working through also the loss of the old territory and making sense of the new. So Rick, you had a question on this theme as well.
Yes, but let me start by thanking you, Johan, and Ivan for letting me gate crash the conversation. It's a privilege to be talking about a book of such subtlety, dry humor, poignancy. My question, I think, builds on what we just heard, because a familiar theme across your work is the deliberate act of accrual, itemization, collection. In Portrait with Keys, your eye is obsessively drawn to Thomasons, or Thomasons, I suppose, purposeless objects found on the city street. And in the near north, you start amassing these little odds and ends offered up by Joburg streets. I'd like you to draw out the analogy between the collection of these micro sculptures and the act of writing. And in particular, if you could comment on how is preservation made meaningful? What redeems what you call monstrous writing, this almost obsessive desire to catalog everything, and what transforms that from a neurotic endeavor into something that has meaning for others?
Right. Yeah, I'm sure some people would want to start with your neurotic comment. It's certainly obsessive. I think a bit of obsession is a useful quality for a writer to have. I think the connection for me probably lies in the importance that I attach to observation. So this is something that I learned as a very young writer from my writing teachers and mentors, was that if you're going to write, and especially if you're going to write about the real world that other people are living in, you have to have your eyes open. Lionel Abrams, who was a Johannesburg poet and editor and was a mentor to me, had a saying in that which he had got from Bosman, and that was distrust the obvious. And if you're an observant person, that means and you're wandering around the city looking at things, or you're observing people, or whatever you're paying attention to as a writer. Distrust the obvious means just don't consider the first thing your eye is drawn to. So this habit of looking from a corner of your eye has become very much part of my writing process. And then collection, the way the language and the objects, I suppose, intersect is that I'm a notebook keeper. And so I've always collected observations, language, bits of language, bits of scraps of things, scraps of writing. And that using that sort of collected material, archived material, is very much a part of my writing process. Then the collection of objects is an extension of that, and I would say that in the context of this book, as it was in Portrait with Keys, it's a kind of ironic extension, because the museum which I write about, the Museum of Objects, exists more in the book than it does in the real world. I have collected things, but it's nowhere as near as extensive a collection as people seem to think. And someone actually already said to me they'd like to come and look at my museum of objects. They're going to be very badly disappointed. It fits in the shoebox. So that's the connection. It's the collections of objects and so on in the texts are really ironic reflections on a much more serious kind of collection, which has to do with collection of language, collection of terminology, collection of observations.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, Ivan, identity is a theme running throughout your work, South African identity, the fluidity of it. So I can't help now to ask this question. We've spoken about it many times, but it came very much to the fore in reading this book. So I want to start, if you will bear with me, with a bit of a strange angle. I want to start with Dan Rood. So Dan, we both know he was one of your near contemporaries, I think, as a student at Wits. And when I read your book, I remember something that Dan said once at a book discussion of the French Institute. I think this was about 95, 96. And I'm paraphrasing from memory in defense now of Dan. I don't want to quote him wrong. But the gist of what he said was something like, to be rooted as a cultural or ethnic community in this country, it helps to have A, historical roots in the countryside, and B, to speak an indigenous language as your first language. And I think he also said he made some space in there for the first language English-speaking South Africans of the 1820 settlers of the Eastern Cape, their ties to the countryside and so on. Now, what was very interesting to me, if I remember correctly, you're a third generation English-speaking South African with Slavic roots on your father's side. Father was Croatian. As far as I know, you don't have what Dan would call historical ties to the countryside. But your book seems to defy his view, because so many of the near north and of your other books is about deep ties to urban place. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And maybe you can say there's always the presence of the veld, the presence of nature in an urban setting could fulfill the similar function as the countryside in Dan's story. But what do you think about this? What's your... Because you clearly are very deeply rooted South African, and so comparing to what he analyzes.
Well, firstly, I should say that Dan and I were not just near contemporaries, we were exact contemporaries. We went through 3 years of Afrikaans and Nederlands together.
Yeah.
So we knew one another quite well in that university context.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the notion that the only people who are deeply rooted in South Africa come from the countryside or have a strong country connection to the countryside is a very reductive view.
Yeah.
So I don't have those connections in an immediate way. I do have come from a family who regarded themselves, and this is from my father's generation onwards, as very explicitly and deeply South African.
Yeah.
And I think that is the source in the end, I think, of that kind of identification. Yeah. It comes much more from your family and your circumstances when you're growing up, I think, than it does from some mythical connection to the land. And I think there's a strong tradition of city living in South Africa. There's a strong tradition of city writing, which I consider myself part of. And I think that tradition is often obscured by the focus on the countryside and the focus on the farm, for instance. As this is, if you're going to write a really important South African novel, it has to have a farm in it. And I mean, I don't want to be facetious about it, but I think, I feel connected through a tradition of writing. I mean, let me rewind slightly. Bosman, who I just mentioned just now, that's an interesting case to look at through this lens. Because aside from his Skalk Lawrence stories and the Mariku and all of that, Bosman wrote extraordinary things about Johannesburg. Right? There's extraordinary writing essays about what it means to live in the city, which I was lucky to discover when I was a young writer. But I think the other kind of work which is marvelous writing. It completely obscures that the urban writing. So I was lucky as well to discover when I went to work as an editor as a young writer, knowing very little about South African writing. I was lucky to discover the drum writers, for instance. So you look at their writing is urban writing. And so I feel connected to that. I think we don't take it seriously enough because of a certain bias in our critical establishment, and maybe it's built into the culture in other ways, towards the sense of the land, the countryside. I like to connect myself through that urban tradition to the great traditions of city writing that exist in every literature. And that's what I'd like to claim.
Okay. Rick, you have a hyphen question.
I do, a punctuation question. So there are many light moments, and this is one of them in the book, but also it's underpinned by seriousness without giving us a political message. It's during the early days of COVID, and you're walking past the Museum of Military History, where a brick wall's been tagged by badly punctuated graffiti. It reads, fuck hyphen lock, and then next word down. So fuck lock down instead of fuck lockdown, right? You mentioned parenthetically that you'd started developing an argument about revolutionary anger and the misplaced hyphen, but then comment on a clutch of cardboard signs with other political slogans, Black Lives Matter, silence is violence, we can't breathe, very much of its moment. I'd like you to pick up the argument you had running in your head, the one that you interrupted. What is the connection between revolution and the misplaced hyphen? Particularly if we think that a hyphen is something which at once binds and severs, something which offers the opportunity of solidarity and distance.
I'm not sure I can develop that argument off the cuff, but what I can do is trace where those kinds of comments of mine come from, and I would like to refer back to the Resta supermarket, which features a character, narrator, who is a pedant, who's a proofreader, a retired proofreader, who is obsessed with mistakes, grammatical mistakes, punctuation errors, misspellings, and so on. And that character, who is treated satirically in my novel, is very close to my heart because he's an exaggerated version of tendencies in myself. I spent most of my working life working as an editor, looking in dictionaries and then correcting people's misplaced hyphens and so on. And so I would say circuitously that comment is a kind of, I think, it's just my interpretation, I think it's a buried satirical jibe at myself for noticing something like that. Because in moments like that, I feel like Aubrey Turl, the character in my novel, and so that's why I put it there. Yeah. I don't think that's answered your question. But
well, it has in that I think, to me, the interruption is itself a kind of caesura, that you don't finish the thought, but that you document what you see rather than linger on that, which is important.
And that's, to tie this conversation back to the collecting conversation, in the Resta supermarket, the narrator is preparing a kind of competition, which he's planning to inflict on people. Where they have to do a proofreading competition called the Proofreaders Derby. And that rested on my own rather obsessive collection of typographical errors and things from newspapers and from texts that I was editing over 20 years. So that's where the collection is a more serious activity, the collection of those kinds of objects, typographical humor, for instance. And that's a more important kind of collection than collection of little bits of metal in the street.
Now, Ivan, another very prominent theme, and I think this is what gives the Near North something of this magical allure. It's Rick and I was talking about how there's this dreamlike atmosphere which you partly achieve by often being very vague about time. You're very particular about space, but it takes one a while to figure out when is what happening and so on and so forth. But I think this also has to do with the fact that the book is often also written through walking. Yeah? Right. Now, I think, thinking back to previous conversations, if I remember correctly, you used to be a cycler in the city, but because of the driving of Joburgers, which is even worse here in Bloemfontein, you ended up becoming a walker in Johannesburg, and you and your life partner Minky walk enormously in the book. So I'd just like to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on why walking has become so important to you, and especially the relationship it has to your creativity and your work, your writing.
Right.
It was just an old theme, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the solitary wanderer, and so on.
Yeah, there's a very long tradition of writers and artists and other people walking as a support for thinking, and I think that's something that certainly happened with me. I didn't set out to do it, but being someone who walks a lot and enjoys walking. There's a comment in the book somewhere, I think it's the architect Michael Sorkin, who says that walking is a natural armature for thinking, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think there's so many accounts of this by people in different disciplines, people in doing different things, who find that walking gets you into a certain frame of mind. It gets you into a kind of rhythm that actually helps you to think things through. So that's one side of why I do it. It's also become a kind of, I wouldn't hesitate to say this, but a kind of resistant thing in me of walking in Johannesburg, because people often say you must be mad to walk around in Johannesburg. It's not a city that is obviously comfortable to walk in, and that encourages people to walk. It's often quite, it's just tricky, right? So I feel very strongly that you learn about the place that you're in a completely different way if you walk and if you drive, or even less if you simply don't go anywhere, and you don't, which South Africans do to an alarming extent. I think that your walking is also, in our situation, but probably almost everywhere, makes you vulnerable. In the sense that you're open to unpredictable things. In our situation, those unpredictable things might be quite unpleasant, but in many instances they're not. The unpredictable can also be surprising or delightful. But you are vulnerable when you're out of your car, you're out of your home, and you're on a city street. You're just open to the world around you, and you're open to the people around you in a different way. And so that's it.
Sort of, I realized recently when I went back to where you and I grew up, struck me for the first time in my life, I actually got to know the place as a child on my bicycle. And it's very similar to walking. So and this, I think, adds to the marvelous allure of the book, that you portray a Johannesburg that people just don't see in cars, and there's something very magical about it. But now, onto another big theme in the book. It's also a work of mourning. So I think some of the examples of what you mourn include the elusiveness of our South African dream of a more just society. You mourn the passing of time, the death of your parents and of a friend who died in very, very unfortunate circumstances. At the same time, this mourning is juxtaposed with many instances of new life. There's Minky, and Minky planting seeds in spring. There's this wonderful character, your friend Dave, who turns a neglected plot of public land into a makeshift public garden. There's your obsessions with writing, recording, testimony, the miniature objects that you collect. So, it's a question that South Africans keep on asking themselves. We all mourn, we all have losses, and they continue to pile up. Where do you get the sources of hope and inspiration that make you believe in this place and love it? And I don't mean it in a political sense, just what is meaningful about the life here for you?
Well, I guess you've touched on some of them. I mean, one of the things that always that gives me hope is the resilience of people. The creativity and resilience of people, which you see in a city like Johannesburg. I mean, you see it everywhere. But against the odds, people try to make things happen.
Yeah.
Right? And Dave's Garden is a good example of that. This is a friend of mine, was once a history teacher, who, with some friends of his, decided to make a public garden on a derelict piece of land in Kensington, on Langemannkop, for those of you who may know Johannesburg, which is well known as a place you could go up and watch the sunset over the city and so on. He and his friends, they found a abandoned plot in which a house had been demolished, and they imagined that they could create a garden there that would blend that very ugly piece of land back into the natural kopje there. And they were all keen, two of them or three of them, they were all keen gardeners. They'd outgrown their suburban plots, so they needed something bigger, and they thought they would make a public garden.
Yeah.
And I started hanging around. We lived in the same neighborhood, and we're very old friends. I started hanging around there. I think he invited me up there because he knew I would write about it one day. I don't think he thought it would take this long. It's 20 years later. But I started hanging around because I knew I would write about it one day.
Yeah.
It was from the beginning. I thought this is something unexpected, eccentric to be doing, but also something quite wonderful to be doing, to be making a welcoming public space at a time when Johannesburg was beginning to feel like a less and less welcoming city.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of thing that gives me hope. I think what happened, I recognize, as you're talking about the book, that there's a sort of internal tension between the mourning and the unhappy side of the book,
Yeah.
and there's something else going on. And I think what happened, I always try to understand afterwards.
Yeah.
The book makes itself in some ways,
Yeah.
and then afterwards you look at it and say, how did it get like this? What
Yeah.
happened? I think one of the obvious things is that I started putting it together during the pandemic,
Yeah.
when there was a lot of death around and
Yeah.
a lot of melancholy around.
Yeah.
And I think we've forgotten about that quite quickly. But that atmosphere that settled over
Yes.
not just our world, but settled over the world, that feeling of impending doom and of things winding down, sort of permeated some of the writing. I began working on this then, and that's what drew in some of the things that I wanted to say about the death of my friend, the death of my parents. I'd wanted to write about those things, but I couldn't find a framework for it.
Yeah.
And then somehow this particular structure for a book, or sort of magnetically drew in the things that belong together.
Yeah.
And I think if the people who write understand, or creative people understand that process where things call to other things, and they find a place together. So it magnetically drew in some of this kind of melancholy material, which is about loss and death and so on. But then also things about gardening and the making things grow, even in those circumstances.
Yeah. That lady who sets up the little stall, and the day after lockdown, she's back again, and there's many examples of that. But Rick, you have a difficult literary question.
Well, it's to couch what we've just been discussing in forms of genre, the personal, mediated, in a particular format. And I don't know if you would self-identify as a writer of autofiction, but I've got a question about autofiction, which I can only ask via a bit of a preamble. So many of your readers will not have an intimate knowledge of the layout of Johannesburg, and some will have no knowledge of it. So there aren't any concessions when it comes to specifics, yet there is a narratological effort to take the reader along, to take them by the hand. I'll give you an example. It's in a section called A Faceless Compass, from which we heard you read earlier, just before the section we heard, in fact, where you assume self-navigation mode, telling us, I go down Riviera Road, a right turn takes me to Monroe Drive, and so on. Not long after this solitary excursion, that I is displaced by a general you. which at once designates anyone who walks this way and anyone who reads these words. We, the readers, now weave through the streets and we receive the gentle warnings. Watch out for speed bumps. A right turn on Goodman Terrace will take you onto Sylvia's Pass. The passage almost concludes, though, with a reversal of roles, where the reader is now the agent and navigator, while you, the writer, seem somehow lost and displaced. You write, rewind again, leave me here at my desk, housebound with a mouse concealed in my hand like a faceless compass. So my question in this about turn is autofiction perhaps more about self-effacement than self-preservation?
I don't know. But what I do know is that I don't identify as a writer of autofiction.
Okay.
And to begin with, I don't identify this as fiction.
Mm.
You know? So now I understand that often when people talk about autofiction, they're actually talking about something they think is factual, in which case autofiction is a somewhat confusing term.
Mm.
But I think of this as a kind of documentary writing.
Okay.
So a surprisingly small amount of it is made up in the sense of purely invented.
Yes.
Right? It draws closely on my own experience. It draws closely on my own reading. But what sets it apart from autofiction, in my view, is that it is highly selective and highly structured. And this goes back to what Johann was saying earlier about the kind of the certain kinds of patterning, or I think the autofiction category feels to me like an almost redundant category. I think that we already have categories which are like memoir, for instance, and autobiography and fiction, and even fictionalized memoir, for instance, creative nonfiction. Do you see where this is going? It's narrative, creative, long-form narrative nonfiction. There are all of these categories which I think the proliferation of the categories is in some ways for me not helpful. I think what autofiction has done, and I'm going in circles slightly, I can hear. What autofiction has done is kind of authorized a lot of unedited, unthought through, unmediated meandering as literature, and it's actually done, and it's constructed as somehow giving you a deeper, closer access to the writer, or at least to the narrator. And I actually think in that sense, for me it's an almost entirely useless category. So I don't think of this as autofiction. I think of it as a kind of documentary writing that rests on observation, and that is then the work in this is assembled over more than 20 years, and then constructed in a way that I think most of the practitioners of autofiction would not recognize as their mode.
Yeah.
I don't know if that.
Yes, I mean, that was a bit of a gambit, I think. And whether you call it autofiction or a roman en jeu, a novel in the key of I, or memoir, what seems to me a trend in let's say some of the autofiction that is winning a lot of prizes and garnering a lot of steam is this tendency to let other people's stories sort of cluster around a central narrator, and that this voice ultimately becomes almost an empty space. Now that's not the sense that I get from your novel, but there is, I think, in your answer for me the suggestion that the highly stylized, highly patterned, highly schematized writing is a way of withdrawing from the I. Does that sound feasible?
Well, I suppose withdrawing and revealing in the way that writing that is not obviously constructed as fiction, in which the writer may be almost entirely obscured. Once you're writing in this mode, that actually working with the material of your own life in this way, then you're always exposing and concealing at the same time. So, so I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the writing of this kind is more detached from the I than the writing in say a first person, obviously fictional story.
Okay. Ivan, back to language. I think a very subtle and long-standing motif in your work, again in the near north, is the influence of Afrikaans, the presence of Afrikaans. You mentioned already you studied Afrikaans at Wits, of course, in the Ampikotse and John Miles. Is there maybe something you could tell us about your relationship to Afrikaans and how it has shaped your writing? I'm also curious because Coetzee is the other South African writer that I now know a bit of, who, of course, wrote a lot about this. And he seems not to be able to come home to any of the two languages or whatever, but yeah, what would you say about that?
Well, I would say to begin with that I think of myself very much as an English language writer.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no question of me ever. Well, never seriously thought about writing in Afrikaans.
Yeah.
So for me, it was a literature that I wanted to read and a language that I loved. But apart from a few misguided attempts when I was a student, I've never really thought, it's never been a serious option for me. So I think of myself as an English language writer. But I grew up in an Afrikaans environment largely. I mean, Pretoria in the 1960s was a very Afrikaans city. I grew up in neighborhoods where sometimes the majority of people spoke Afrikaans. When I was very, very small, we lived around in Pretoria West, and it's there was a lot of Afrikaans in the air.
Yeah.
There was clearly a lot of Afrikaans in the public space. Most, if you went into a shop or you went to the post office, you tended to speak Afrikaans in those years. So I grew up with the language, and then decided to study Afrikaans literature, which actually turned, again, I knew very little about the literature until I went to study at Wits. I had a kind of Christian national education view of what Afrikaans writing was, which makes it even more strange that I decided to go and study it. But it was just really an excuse to go and read books and spend my time reading. And then I was very lucky to be studying in those years when the Afrikaans department at Wits was so fascinating. There's such interesting people teaching there. And they were also involved in publishing, which became very much part of my own life. And it was one of the inspirations for that, was that it was the years of Taurus, and the work, Ampi and John and Ernst Lindenberg, and they were publishing extraordinary books as they were being written.
Yeah.
And so it was a really extraordinary kind of antidote to the English department where we were studying the canon, and it was just the years when South African writing was coming into the syllabus for the first time under the influence of Stephen Gray and Tim Cousins and so on. But generally speaking, when you studied English, you studied the European tradition.
Yeah.
and it was extraordinary to be studying Afrikaans at the same time, where you were studying books as they were being published.
Yeah.
And work that was so immediately connected to our environment.
Okay.
And so it had a profound effect, I think, on my writing interests. And my relationship to it now is that I don't read as much Afrikaans literature as I used to.
Yeah.
But I think I don't read as much as I used to generally. So I don't think that's necessarily a special thing. But I still try to keep up with some of the writing and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Now, more or less, I think our second last question. I think it's the inevitable one, also about nostalgia and change. When I was reading the book, also I remembered something that Karel Schoeman was fond of saying. What he appreciated about Europe is the longevity of the landmarks. And for example, you would go to a shop or a restaurant that's been there for a century or more or whatever. But in South Africa, he thought that type of longevity is largely absent. So our landmarks come and go so fast. Now, since the Restless Supermarket, published, I think, about 95, 96?
A little bit later than 2001.
Oh, so, okay.
Yeah.
But it's a novel about our democratic transition. And at least since then, maybe even the Exploded View before that, you've grappled with this dialectic of change and the need to hold onto something familiar in the context of ordinary life in Johannesburg. I thought of Svetlana Boym, restorative versus reflexive nostalgia, and I think your book is very much, if it's nostalgic, if it's more reflexive, the collection and so on. So I was curious, I mean, you've lived in Johannesburg going on to 50 years, as you said, and it's a city that changes enormously. Jacob Lemini in the cover quote says it's a city in perpetual crisis. So if you now look back, what do you count as the most enduring, familiar of Johannesburg with which you orientate yourself as a Joburger?
Well, I think you touched on something that's very close to my heart. The whole question of change, acceptance of change, resistance to change. I mean, it's at the heart of our social, political life, right?
Yeah.
So I sympathize with the notion that it's, one of the joys of a city life, of having an urban life, is the idea that you can revisit places that have been there forever.
Yeah.
You can go down to the pub where you drank your first beer when you were 15 with your father. And
Yeah.
So I mean, there is something delightful about that. There's something when I travel and I go back to cities that are less changeable. I even notice that you can go back to places and they're still there. The restaurants are still there and so on. But I think that, so it's easy to feel that you're displaced. So I always remind myself of a couple of things. And the one thing is that the displacement that's been felt by the majority of our population as far exceeds any displacement that I might feel from my city, right? That we have a history of violent displacement of people, and that in some way this experience ties us together in some ways. That that being displaced from the place that you feel is your natural home is something that many people have gone through in much more violent circumstances. We're also a society that is so desperately in need of change that in a way one has to embrace it on some level and live with it. So I suppose my way of doing this is that there are aspects of life in Johannesburg as I used to experience it that I miss. One of them being that the city has become, for middle-class people like me, more and more suburban. that to even access a genuinely urban lifestyle is very difficult because one's almost compelled to live in a suburban way. So there are things that I do miss, but I also try to just, in my work, I suppose, negotiate it, express it, structure it in some way, try to present it in a way that is not a kind of blind hankering after the good old days, but that also registers that that things are lost in the process of urban decay, for instance, that don't just affect me; they actually affect everyone who lives in the city. And so I think it's a difficult terrain. The accusation of nostalgia is leveled often at writers, and I've had it leveled at me a couple of times. I think a certain kind of nostalgia for your childhood, for instance, is a perfectly natural feeling, and I think most people feel that to some extent. One just has to find a way of dealing with that sensibly and dealing with it critically, and Boehm provides the ammunition for doing that. So.
Maybe I've got that Boehm quote here because I think what you do here is very much, she says that nostos and algia, nostos is the home, algia is the longing, and then she says reflective nostalgia thrives in algia. The longing itself delays the homecoming, wistfully, ironically, desperately. Restorative nostalgia doesn't think of itself as nostalgia, but rather as truth and tradition. Reflective nostalgia dwells on the ambivalences of human longing and belonging and doesn't shy away from the contradictions of modernity. Restorative nostalgia protects the absolute truth, while reflective nostalgia calls it into doubt. I think you would live with that. Right. I would appreciate it though if you could write about something that I unqualifiedly miss, which is papita. We can carry that discussion on this restaurant in Yeovil we all used to hang out in. Okay, Rick,
The last question for me, I think for the evening, and looks ahead. Links to what you've been talking about now. At one point in the book, you are chatting to an Italian friend who says the problem with Rome is that the history is so static, right? And that the changeability of Johannesburg at least is exciting. And that seems to link to a curious emotion that you express at one point when you're talking about the garden. You talk about glee and the opportunity to revisit things and retill the land, as it were. So this is shortly after Dave's garden has been completed, and you write that the journalists descend, they're avid of facts and dates and names, and you're a little possessive over it. You say that these strangers are tramping around in my material. But then this irritation gives way to that very strange emotion, glee, you say. As you reflect that when the journalists have forgotten they ever visited this place, I might still be tending these pages. So for me, this seems to say less about the ephemerality of journalism and more about the unfinished or unfinishable business of creative writing, whether in the documentary mode or in a fictional mode. And I was wondering if you could say why this opportunity to revisit, retill, is a source of glee rather than frustration. And second question, what is likely to be retilled in your subsequent work?
That's a really nice question. I mean, it brings us back to the earlier part of the discussion, which had to do with collecting, for instance, and that I made a joke about my friend Dave and the amount of time it had taken me to get to telling his story, but it's that too. I think, the glee arises from the fact that if you do the kind of writing I do, the deadlines are self-imposed, and they might be very, very far away from the moment at which you first have the idea, or you first make the notes towards something. And that's the slowness of the the actual process, which I think it used to frustrate me a bit when I was a younger writer, because you have this pressure on you to get another book out there and finish another novel. You begin, even if someone is not putting that pressure on you, it's an internal pressure. That's sort of lessened over the years, and the slow assembly, which is kind of how I've been working in more recent years, has come to feel like a potential strength of the work in a situation in which things are changing very quickly. It actually helps to be working slowly, to slow things down, because you can deal with the change in the text, right? I think one of the if you're trying to document a city like Johannesburg, you're trying to document South Africa, you're trying to write about the now. Things move so quickly and they change so quickly that you can easily feel left behind. So if you slow down and you just, as a writer, think things through in the text, you're able to build that process of change into the piece itself. So, I mean, to try, and it sounding rather abstract, but the first notes towards this piece about Dave's garden were made in 2005, right? And the whole garden was built and then abandoned again by about 2011. Yeah. So this section in the book covers something that happened a 6-year period roughly. That's more than 10 years ago. It's 13 years ago. If I had written that, which I thought I was doing at the time, if I had written that as an essay and published it, it would have had a completely different meaning and different resonance, because Johannesburg was not the city that it is now. So being able to come back to that material and embed that story in the contemporary framework gives it, for me, an entirely different resonance. And that's only because I took so much time over it. So I think, to your second question, what I'll be going back to. I have a lot I still want to write, but time is short. So I have endless amounts of notes and things which I think which I would like them to suggest at some point what they are and what they'd like to, where they'd like to be. But to do that, I need probably more time than I have.
Okay, we've come to the end of our allotted hours, so goes without saying that the Near North, and I think some of your other books are on sale outside, and I guess you'll be willing to sign a book or two.
I will.
But Ivan, I'm going to ask you to end with an incredibly beautiful piece of writing. I think of the most beautiful you've ever written, which says something of its commemoration. It's a type of mourning, but the light shines through. So if you give us the pen.
Sure. So I will just read this. My father made 8mm films for a few years when Felicity and I were small, and then he lost interest and packed the camera and projector away in his wardrobe. He was not easily persuaded to show the films. It was too much of a palaver setting up the projector in the lounge, attaching a bed sheet to the picture rail with clothes pegs, threading the film on the sprockets. From the beginning, my mother had opposed the filmmaking adventure as a foolish extravagance. She thought the money would have been better spent on something useful, like a washing machine. You don't know what it takes to keep this household running, she used to say. If you were the one who had to put food on the table, you'd think twice. And to the walls, that's your father. When he comes in from work, he expects to find his supper waiting for him, but he never stops to think how it got there. My sister and I cannot watch the films often enough, even though most of them are boring. There is an entire reel of vintage cars going round the fountain circle with the water jetting up behind and their wheels turning backwards. Another of saloon cars drifting through Crowthorne Corner at the Kyalami racing circuit, which my father made on a day out with Len Wilson, his friend from the motor trade. Then there's the boxcar derby at the Voortrekker Monument. This one interests me more because I almost remember the day. My own memories are still there beneath the familiar images, barely visible but impossible to ignore, like the creases in the sheet. We watch the family films last, and seeing ourselves or people we know is always thrilling. We are only in 2 or 3 scenes. There is one of Felicity and me on the beach near Mhlanga, standing in a splashy pool of silver fish spoiled from the nets of Indian fishermen. And one made at my cousin Tommy's birthday, when Esme dropped her ice cream and wouldn't stop crying. And the one we like best, my grandfather in the backyard of my uncle's house in Valeria. Oud Tats lived with my Uncle Babe and Auntie Lenny, my father's younger brother and his wife. My grandmother died young, and the old man could not be left to fend for himself. We visited him often on Sunday afternoons, and my father must have made the film on one of those days. My grandfather, who had once been a market gardener, kept a vegetable garden in the yard, and the edge of it is visible on the left of the frame. A tour of the garden was a necessary part of these visits, and we would go home with a bag of runner beans or carrots or whatever was ready to be picked. In the film, Oud Tats, my aunt and my uncle are standing in the dappled shade under a jacaranda, lined up for the camera like a delegation. The focus wavers for a few moments and then fixes on them. My father is too far away. Had he been a yard or 2 closer, you might have made out their features, even in the shadows. The projector whirs over the silent tableau. We squirm on the blankets and pillows where we have settled to watch. A familiar drama is already unfolding in us, as inevitably as a liturgy. We wait for my father to speak. "Who's that on the left?" he asks at last. "I can't see who it is." "It's Oud Tats." "I don't think so. Tell him to come forward a bit." "Oud Tats, come closer." "Louder, he can't hear you." "Oud Tats, come closer." It works. Our voices reach them in that faraway yard, and they step forward, glancing at one another and saying things we cannot hear, and laughing, still laughing, into the light. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.